it would seem from a purely military perspective be completely counterintuitive to attack particularly the US and also the UK and France, because Iran is getting a hammering just from Israel at the moment. If President Trump decided to lean into this militarily, which he suggested, then with the power the Americans have, that would be very bad news, I think, for Iran.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Hamish to Bretton-Gordon on the show. He's a former British Army colonel. He walks us through what's really happening in Iran with these attacks from Israel, whether there will be an uprising within Iran, the role that Vladimir Putin is playing. These are situational allies between Russia and Iran, and whether he'll actually be called up to mediate a discussion, negotiation with the United States on Israel's side. So what a bizarre situation, especially when there's a war going on in Ukraine, and we haven't heard much about that in the last few weeks. So all that today, we discuss whether Iran's nuclear capabilities have been destroyed. What's the update there? So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page. Or if you don't have time to watch YouTube, we are now a podcast. So stream us every day wherever you get your podcasts. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former British Army colonel, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, you and I, on practically every interview we've ever done, you've referred to Iran as the axis of evil, and that it's kind of the centerpiece of anything evil within the Middle East. We know that Iran funds Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and so while this attack from Israel into Iran was a surprise, some would say it really isn't, and that it was a long time coming. But from your point of view, Hamish, Israel launching this attack, was it the right thing to do?
Well, I think there are a whole host of things that perhaps we need to unpick here. I suppose the closest crocodile to the canoe is that sort of last week it became apparent that the Iranians were getting very close to having enriched uranium to a level where it could then be a viable component for a nuclear warhead. Now, the International Atomic Energy Agency said that, and the Iranians themselves said that. So that was really sort of goading, I think, the Israelis themselves. So and this has been a long time coming. Last year, the Israeli Air Force destroyed a lot of air defense around the nuclear sites and very clearly said, if you do not stop enriching uranium, we will take the facilities out. And, to a degree, the Americans were supporting that. Trump, in his inimitable fashion, has been trying to do yet another deal to persuade the Iranians to stop trying to make a nuclear missile in return for some sort of deal, sanctions, no doubt. It was very clear also that last week that the Iranians had given Trump, a stiff two fingers, and that wasn't going to happen. So it was very, very much indicated. And as you say, Iran has been at the root of most of what's been bad in the Middle East, probably for the last 2 decades. Not only Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas, as you mentioned, but the Iranian militias that set fire to Iraq once Saddam Hussein was disposed, and a whole host of other things. So I think it was no surprise that it was in the air, as it were. But of course, once it actually happened, I think the enormity of it, what people find difficult to believe or understand. Iran, this massive, massive country, and Israel, a tiny country. I think the other hugely significant thing is that Iran's allies have sort of evaporated into the mist. There is virtually nobody who is marching to their aid. I mean, their closest allies, one would have thought to be the Russians. They've given the Russians so much missile and drone technology and actually hardware in their fight in Ukraine. You would have thought they might wade in. And the other axis of evil have sort of been quiet. So Iran's pretty isolated, and And actually, we're yet to find out the full scale of the attacks, but it seems clear that Iran is not going to have a nuclear weapon to use anytime soon, which is probably a good thing for the safety of the world.
So I guess the consensus from Israel was, Hamish, that they bomb Iran before they get the bomb. Now, of course, Iran has basically been denying that they have nuclear weapons for a few decades now. But is what you're saying that they finally kind of came around and admitted that they had enough to eventually create an atomic bomb?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, the people who've studied this in detail have always been absolutely convinced that Iran wants a nuclear weapon of some description. And it's their avowed attempt to destroy the great Satan, which they, say as Israel. And, conventionally, even though Iran is a large country, its conventional military is fairly antiquated and not a match really for the Israelis, although the Israelis are a lot smaller. The sort of massive elephant in the room for the Iranians is that Israel does have nuclear weapons, and that completely unbalances the whole piece. And of course, the Israelis have the Americans backing them up. And now, hitherto, the Iranians might have thought Russia was doing the same, but Russia has evaporated, as I said. So it was apparent that the Israelis said they were going to do it, and they've carried through and do it. And I don't think there is any, I don't think anybody thinks that Iran wasn't and isn't still desiring to have a nuclear capability, and that is just still the rhetoric coming out of Tehran. I might say, quite a few of the senior leaders have been taken out in these attacks. And it would appear quite a few of the remaining senior leaders are trying to hightail it to Moscow at the moment. So it's very difficult to get a clear picture. We know that the Al-Quds Command, these are the people who run operations over the sea, like Hezbollah and Hamas, have also been hit hard. So it would be, it's unclear the state of the Iranian government and military commands at the moment, and I expect it will take a while to find out exactly how denuded they've been by these attacks.
So is it unclear currently, Hamish, that the state of Iran's nuclear program, whether Israel has targeted enough that there is now no nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't think we can be absolutely definitive about that. We know that the main site, Natanz, has been hammered really hard by the Israelis. The Israelis and the Americans have said that they believe, the prospect of Iran getting a nuclear weapon has been put back many years by this. There is another key area called Fordow that has also been hit very hard. I don't think one can say definitively that is the end of Iran's nuclear program, but it would seem that those people who have a view and understand this sort of technology are saying it's certainly been pushed back a few years. Whether it's been completely destroyed, I think that would be very difficult to say, because we don't know what the Russians have been doing. We assume the Russians have been helping the Iranians with their nuclear program, and unfortunately we assume the Russians are also helping the North Koreans, and actually the North Koreans are probably closer to having a viable nuclear weapon than the Iranians ever were. But I think it's sure to say that Iran is not in a position to fire a nuclear missile anytime soon. Whether that will be the end of it, we will see. We now hear stuff coming out of Trump's office that they want to restart the peace negotiations, and Trump would prefer to do a deal to end this for good than allow Israel to keep bombing these sites until they're completely out of commission.
Would you expect Iran to admit that their nuclear weapons had been completely destroyed, Hamish, or is it in their best interest to kind of keep up a facade that they at least have some?
Well, most people involved in the sort of nuclear conflict area rely on ambiguity to, so people don't know exactly what the position is, and certainly we don't know a great deal about, in public about the Iranian nuclear capability anyway. But I'm sure they will not want to admit that they're, what they see as one of their key weapons against the Israelis is now no more. That is very much to admit defeat. So I don't think they'll ever do that. Whether they now decide to negotiate with the Americans, because the deal, Trump's great deal, is all about sanctions. And sanctions have crippled Iran over the last few decades. And although the Ayatollahs and the mullahs might live in great wealth and comfort, a lot of people across Iran, are starving and really struggling. And the lack of being able to trade with the West has had a profound effect. Most of Iran Air jets are parked up because, they are Western jets and they have no spares. So, you kind of fly around Iran in a sort of safe jet, I would have thought. One gets the impression, and there seems to as well, that the rank and file, the common people in Iran would like to see peace, would like to get rid of sanctions and get back on with life. But unfortunately, in autocratic, tyrannical states like Iran, similar to Russia, it is the single leaders who make the decisions, complete out with any concern for the population. These are not democracies as we know them in the West.
But is Israel hoping for, obviously Israel is striking Iran, but are they hoping that civilians in Iran will kind of create this uprising and this, I guess, protest against Ali Khamenei and his and everything going on with his leadership and with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and just kind of agree with Benjamin Netanyahu that Iran and the Supreme Leader have been funneling all of the country's money into funding wars and into keeping themselves rich, really taking a leaf out of Putin's book and leaving the rest of them quite poor and not even putting any money towards electricity, gas and food?
I'm sure the sort of second order consequences that the Israelis and the Americans might have would be exactly that, for a public uprising. There have been several in the last few years over girls having to wear headscarves, about girls going to school. Very, very well supported uprising over the last few years that have been put down brutally by the regime. So I think there is a hope that there is a swell of anti-leadership, anti-government, anti-Ayatollah feeling. And I'm sure the Israelis and actually a lot of people in the West would hope that the people of Iran, might have a chance here to have a better life. But the Ayatollahs have run the place for decades now, and it is a pretty brutal Islamic state that is ruled, with a rod of iron and with fear. Public hangings are not irregular occurrences. So it's a pretty brutal regime. But the Iranian population is a highly educated population, and they sort of realise what is right and wrong. Unfortunately, a bit like Russia, the social media is so heavily controlled by the government that actually getting the true facts out amongst the population are incredibly difficult. So a bit like Russia, people are getting fed the information that the government want them to have. So whether that will have an impact, I think there is no way that the Ayatollahs can shape what is happening and the attacks from Israel as anything, as a major blow to the regime. And people must also, I expect, understand that the proxies like Hezbollah, the Houthis and Hamas, virtually don't exist anymore, along with Iranian militias. So, Iran's ability to affect things outside Iran are much, much denuded. And, I'm sure people are realizing this isn't the great state in the Middle East to rule the Middle East and further. So there is a hope. There might be, the population might get their voice.
I wonder, Hamish, do you think it was clear to the United States, to Steve Witkoff, that after 5 rounds of negotiations to end Iran's nuclear program, that they really had no intention of giving them up? Because what we saw was 5 rounds of these talks since Trump's been inaugurated, And then Trump said 5 days ago or 6 days ago that Iran had started to become much more aggressive in these negotiations. And then we saw Iran's defense minister threaten to target US military bases if conflict were to begin in the region. So I wonder if we obviously were meant to have the 6th round of negotiation yesterday on Sunday, that they of course got cancelled. 5 rounds of failed negotiations and a rejected proposal from the United States. Was it clear to the US that this would no longer go on, that a negotiation was no longer viable, and that Israel striking Iran was probably the next best option?
Well, unfortunately, since Trump came to power, and all his negotiations, his team's negotiations, despite the fact we were all very hopeful because he told us how brilliant he was at doing this, things have just not gone well. We've seen, a similar chain of events happening in his negotiations with the Russians, and it would appear that actually, autocratic states like Russia and Iran rather, like having to negotiate with somebody like Trump because, they seem to run complete rings around him. And, and then it gets, it ultimately gets back to the fact that, he's directed a path that can only be finished with force rather than with negotiation. So I suppose nobody's particularly surprised that we've got to this position. Because why would the Iranians do it if they thought that they were getting the upper hand on Trump? I think it's the same with the Russians and Putin. I think it's taken a long time for President Trump to realise, first of all, that Putin thinks he's an idiot and Putin can run rings around him, and secondly, that Trump has suddenly realised that Putin has absolutely no interest in peace, and because of that, Trump and his team seem to have walked away almost from Ukraine. We've heard absolutely nothing about it in the last week or so. Similarly with Iran, when Trump was failing to get a deal in Ukraine-Russian war, he then focused back on Iran, and unfortunately his stardust hasn't worked there, and in fact a bit like Russia has made it worse. That, as you say, inevitable, the only conclusion was, which presumably the Israeli government came to, that they had to, the only way to stop the Iranian nuclear program was to bomb it, because there was no way that Trump was going to negotiate it away.
Do you see, you mentioned this at the start of the interview, Hamish, but do you now see Iran coming back to the negotiating table to discuss a deal with the United States over ending their nuclear program?
Well, there does seem there's the first whiff of that on the on the news channels. So presumably there is some substance to it, and maybe it would make sense with some very senior leadership in Tehran now being taken out, with others wanting to flee to Moscow. Those that remain might see that actually, if they can, rather than have their country pummeled for the next weeks or months by the Israeli Air Force, if they can have some sort of negotiation with Trump, and if their nuclear program is already pretty much hammered, certainly for the time being, then maybe some sort of deal where sanctions are lifting actually looks quite compelling at the moment for those who remain in Tehran, and let's hope so. I mean, I think everybody who's looking and watching this would a bit like in Ukraine, wants to see a just ceasefire, and if a ceasefire is achieved in Iran, that means that's the end of their nuclear ambitions, and sanctions are lifted so that the basic civilians in Iran can start living a normal life again, then I certainly would welcome that.
Iran, they had threatened to target US military bases, saying that they know where they are, they're not far off, we can target them. But then they also said that they would target UK and French military bases if the situation ended up being that these countries were taking the side of Israel, that they were directing them to continue their attacks on Iran. So, Hamish, if that did happen and Iran targeted these US, UK and French military bases, how do you think these countries should respond?
Well, certainly when it comes to the UK, we've already moved more fighter jets to Cyprus, which, in flying time is very, very close to Iran, and certainly when the UK helped take down some of the missiles fired in April and October last year, jets from Cyprus were involved. I would be surprised if Iran did target US and UK troops in the region. I think the Al Quds command, which would do this, have been severely hammered over the last couple of days. Their capabilities, as we described, for external activity is pretty small. It would require, they could possibly fire some missiles at some of these bases, but I might live to be proved wrong. But it would seem, from a purely military perspective, be completely counterintuitive to attack, particularly the US and also the UK and France, because Iran is getting a hammering just from Israel at the moment. If President Trump decided to lean into this militarily, which he suggested, then with the power the Americans have, that would be very bad news, I think, for Iran. And similarly, although the UK and French, are much less of a concern, I expect, for the Iranians, again, it would be another, I think, nail in the Ayatollah's coffin, as it were. So I would be surprised if the Iranians did attack anywhere except Israel.
Do you see the possibility of a wider war coming in the Middle East, Hamish, one that would see the United States having to follow Israel into a war?
Well, I think things are fairly finely balanced at the moment. I am not sure that I do, and I sort of really to restate what I said earlier on, that there doesn't seem to be anybody else jumping in to support Iran. It really hasn't got many allies. I don't think there's any way the Russians are going to jump in to help them. There's talk of some of the other Islamic countries in the region that might. But it seems very, very unlikely. China is being pretty silent and staying back, and the two countries are so ideologically opposed. You cannot see that the Chinese would get involved in any serious fashion. Other terror networks, Islamic State might support them in some sort of way, and the Iranians help the growth of Islamic State, but Islamic State is a much denuded capability too. So the other Gulf states, the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis, I think they are very much, they want to see peace in the region, and most of them see Iran as the evil and the person that's sort of trying to set the Middle East alight. So I don't think so, but I do, to try and prevent that happening, actually. That is something that Trump could probably do, is within his gift, by flexing his military muscles. But at the moment, although that is what Iran would like to see, I just don't think they've got anybody who's going to charge over the hill to help them.
Especially when Donald Trump's, he's made these investment deals with many of the Gulf states in the last few months. You wouldn't want to be pissing him off, especially when there's so much more money involved. But Hamish, you mentioned Vladimir Putin. I wonder, what do you think his position is in this conflict, and what position does he want to be in? Because, of course, when these kind of conflicts happen outside of Russia, Ukraine, the attention goes off that war. We want it to remain on that war because it's obviously so unjust. But at the same time, it means that he's able to kind of fly under the radar. But with this delicate situation with Iran, I wonder if he's also trying to kind of proposition himself into a role like the United States has had, where he's almost going to be called up to mediate.
Absolutely, I think you're spot on there, and there are murmurings of exactly that. Which would be so ironic. that Putin puts himself forward as a great deal maker and the great peacemaker, and it would make complete sense because, of course, he has, in effect, he is an ally of the Iranians. They work closely together. The Iranians have given him lots of missiles and drones, and he, over the years, have given them lots of technical advice. Of course, it was the Russians and Hezbollah who kept Assad in power for the Assad family for decades, working, hand in glove with each other. So, when it's worked, the Russians have been very happy to work with the proxies of Iran. So that would be close. And also, the Russian Jewish population is not insignificant. I mean, the Israeli jets, is that the Israeli national airline still flies to Moscow on a regular basis, and there is some dialogue there. So actually having Putin as the great deal maker rather than Trump, in a funny sort of way, might actually work. I mean, it's sort of ironic, but I think those of us who are focused very much on Ukraine, are really concerned that the world is completely looking away from Ukraine at the moment. There's virtually no reporting, and this is just absolutely playing into Putin's hands. What on earth is he doing and planning? It was only a couple of weeks ago we were talking how brilliant the Ukrainian Secret Service had taken out half his nuclear capable jets, and how the Russians are on the back foot. Suddenly, Putin is back on a sort of righteous sort of pedestal, as it were, as the person who could perhaps bring peace between Israel and Iran. Just the irony is beyond consider.
Well, what do you think? How do you think this will change? Okay, so if Putin gets to be put in a position where he's on Donald Trump's level of being called up to mediate, called up to broker a deal, if you will. You've got the United States sitting in Israel's corner, and then you've got Putin sitting in Iran's corner, and then called to the negotiating table to, I guess, broker a peace deal here. But without the knowledge of kind of flying under the radar yet again, Hamish, was this 2-week deadline that Trump actually put on Putin, and that's now up. That 2-week deadline, he said, Vladimir Putin, you've got 2 weeks to prove to me that you want peace, otherwise I'm going to respond very differently. Now those 2 weeks are now up, and we haven't heard anything. All we've heard is that they had a 50-minute phone conversation on Saturday where he wished him happy birthday, and that Putin condemned Israel's attacks, and that Donald Trump supposedly said you should also end your own war, and that's that. So if this new conflict between Israel and Iran now surfaces, and we've got these two heads of their state now coming to the negotiating table to represent two different countries, how does that affect them trying to broker the end of the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, it's a strange place, strange world we live in at the moment, and the main beneficiary in a very sort of indirect way of the current conflict with Iran and Israel is, of course, the Russians, because the price of oil has shot up to $80-90 a barrel, which Trump's ace for his deal to get Putin to the peace table was to push oil below $40 a barrel. So again, it would appear that Putin is the great deal maker and not Trump. So I think it's a really confusing international picture at the moment, with Trump and Putin perhaps focusing, on the world stage, fluffing up their feathers, as it were, over Iran and Israel. But actually, of course, us sat here in the UK and in Europe, what's happening in Ukraine is really the thing that concerns us most, and is the most direct threat to us. But we've got Trump and Putin who are talking a different language about a different country. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to see if and when the sort of everybody concentrates back on Ukraine, because at the moment it's all about what's happening in the Middle East and preventing escalation there, which seems to be focusing the minds of of Trump and Putin, and what's happening in Ukraine is happening behind closed doors, as it were.
And it's important to keep the headlines on Russia, Ukraine. Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.